It's fantastic to have you all here after our successful Energy Poverty Action Week in 2022 and 2023. So we are back this year with the mainly support from the Generator project, which Saska will introduce more later, and a full 5-day webinar series to dive deep into the energy justice topic. So over the next few days, we will explore everything from how we talk about energy poverty, food poverty, the terminology, to structural barriers and global north, global south, study cases, and the community action and policy solutions. A huge thank you to all our collaborating institutions and the people behind this, and uh, and our 30 amazing guest speakers who made this possible. So, and of course, thank you for joining us. Your participation is what makes this conversation meaningful. So we will have the Q&A session in the end after all the presentation finished. So you can feel free to submit your questions through the chat box, and please don't forget to indicate which speaker you want to ask for. And yeah, let's kick things off by welcoming Professor Saska Petrova from the University of Manchester. Saska is a human geography professor and the PI of the Generator project. She researches the intersection of gender precarity and household energy use, focusing on how low carbon transitions interact with social and environmental inequalities. Saska, over to you.
Thank you, Lynn. Dear colleagues and friends, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Global Energy Justice Action Week. I think this is a gathering dedicated to advancing equity and fairness in global energy transitions. And this week, I think, is not just about dialogue, it's about action. And action is needed more than ever. Together, we will explore how energy systems can serve all communities, address climate change related issues, and hopefully uphold the principles of justice. This event is proudly co-organized by the Generate project, and I would like to thank all partner organizations in my name as well, for their hard work and dedication. And I have a super special thank you to the Generate researchers, Lynn and Julia, for their incredible efforts to bring us all together. I would just like to say a few words about the Generate project. So Generate is a European Research Council selected consolidated project, which is financed by the UKRI. And the project is dedicated to exploring the intersections, as Lynn mentioned, of gender precarity and green energy transformations. Over a 5-year period, we will scrutinize how energy systems and policies shape lived experiences, particularly for those in marginalized communities, and how gender dynamics influence access, participation, justice, and transformation in energy governance. By focusing on precarity, and we understand energy precarity as a politically induced injustice, the project seeks to illuminate who benefits, who bears the risks, and how we can design energy futures that are equitable and inclusive. We collaborate with 6 local organizations in the Western Balkans, and we use the Western Balkans as a region that we can learn from, and we can collect insights to inform global discussions on gender and energy. If you would like to hear more about the project, please get in touch, but I would not like to talk for longer because we have some amazing speakers. Thank you once again, and welcome to the Global Energy Justice Action Week. Thank you.
Thank you, Shashka, for that fantastic opening. So next we have our amazing keynote, Dr. Tony J. Rames from the University of Michigan. Tony is a Tishman Professor of Environmental Justice, Director of the Detroit Sustainability Clinic, and the founder of the Urban Energy Justice Lab and the Energy Equity Project. His work focuses on equitable access to clean, affordable energy and addressing persistent disparities across race, income, and place. Tony, the floor is yours. I will stop sharing from my side and you can share, yeah, screen now.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for that introduction. Thank you and Stefan for the invitation to be with everybody today. I want to say good morning to some, good afternoon to others. And I'm going to pull up my slides while we get started here. Hopefully, everyone can see my slides. As mentioned, I am Tony Reams, professor at the University of Michigan, and I've been invited to just spend a little time with you today to talk about why words matter. So to kick us off, I'd like to frame our time together, introducing a quote to some and maybe reintroducing to others, uh, a heavily quoted text from Dr. Martin Luther King that says, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." This quote is often used in instances to understand the incremental march toward the promise of a more equitable and just society. However, Martin Luther King's quote is a paraphrasing of a portion of a sermon delivered in 1853 by the abolitionist minister Theodore Parker. In that sermon, Parker says, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends toward justice." Now, for Parker, there is no guarantee of the moral universe doing as he wishes. It is only through his own conscience and thereby his own actions that he believes justice will be achieved. Now, former US President Barack Obama, who often used this quote in many of his speeches, makes Parker's point more clear in a later version of the quote by saying the arc of the moral universe may bend toward justice, but it doesn't bend on its own. His modification is a recognition that for us to truly achieve justice, it is going to take some action. So all of you are here today in the right place at the right time, this Global Energy Justice Action Week. Now, what happens when the words we use to describe hardship end up actually reinforcing hardship? Imagine a family in Detroit, Michigan, struggling to keep the lights on and the heat running through a Michigan winter. This picture here gives you a vision of what it looks like here in wintertime. Now, policy and policymakers may label this family as energy poor, but does that phrase empower them or does it stigmatize them? Does it reduce their lived experience to just some technical category? Today, through the slides and the rest of the conversations, we'll talk about how words like energy poverty, energy vulnerability shape our policy agendas, and whether these terms advance equity or allow it to persist. And in doing so, what is at risk? Our words could really have life or death consequences. In January 2020, 83-year-old Bernice Hankins and her 61-year-old son, Jeffrey, were found dead inside a Detroit home with no heat. Temperatures in Detroit that night were around 21 degrees Fahrenheit or -6 degrees Celsius. Neighbors said that Bernice and her son were good people who lived in the neighborhood for over 40 years. Their home had recently flooded, which damaged their furnace, and so they were using portable electric heaters. Now, the Hankins are not an isolated story. Their fate is wrapped in a larger narrative of people all over the world who face the inability to attain a socially and materially necessitated level of energy services in their homes. In the US, as the pandemic era energy shutoff protections disappeared, some 20 million households were facing disconnection due to accumulated energy debt, leading to some services like cooling becoming a luxury, too expensive for some to afford, as a climate crisis increases our need for cooling. Some 48 million across Europe are unable to affordably heat their homes, while nearly 1.2 billion around the world lack connectivity or affordable or reliable access to electricity. The ongoing energy crisis also has geopolitical implications as countries like Iran turn to Russia and China to address blackouts and record heat. And some countries are actually tackling this issue heads on, like Canada, pulling together researchers and professionals to address energy poverty. But is it enough? Are we using the right language? Are the right people at the table? So we must acknowledge that language matters. Language is not trivial. It shapes how policymakers, researchers, and the public understand our problems and then how we act on them. The term energy poverty has become dominant globally, but here's the problem. It reduces hardship to a metric, sometimes seen as percent of income spent on energy, or whether a household can keep warm or cool. It frames people as the poor, which can stigmatize rather than empower. It obscures structural drivers like neoliberal economic policies, colonial legacies, and infrastructural violence that create and sustain inequalities. And so words can illuminate systemic injustice or obscure it by focusing blame on individuals, and too often our vocabulary has done the latter. So drawing from our recent nature energy perspective, looking at our terms, I want to talk about the 5 ways that dominant discourses shape and sometimes distort our policy agendas. First is measurement bias. Indicators are often expert-led, like many of us on the call today, rarely participatory. Communities are often spoken about and not spoken with. Second is narrow drivers. Causes are reduced to things like high prices and efficient buildings and low incomes, while the structural exclusion is often ignored. We also simplify the traps. Composite indices sometimes obscure deeper politics of inequality. It can lead to stigmatization. Labels like feel poor or hard to reach sometimes reinforce othering. And then medicalization, using clinical language like diagnosis or prescription, sometimes shifts the blame onto individuals instead of systems. These framings matter. They shape funding priorities, research agendas, and public perceptions, and they often perpetuate inequity rather than dismantle it. So we can lean on one of the pillars of energy justice, recognition justice. Recognition justice allows us to emphasize the importance of acknowledging and valuing the diverse identities, cultures, and histories of marginalized groups, rather than focusing solely on economic inequality. It seeks to address injustices that are rooted in disrespect, humiliation, and misrepresentation by affirming the equal moral standing and intrinsic values of all people and all groups. And it argues that genuine justice requires not only the fair redistribution of resources, but also the fair recognition of all individuals and communities. Now, in the US, while there is not necessarily a formal recognition of energy poverty, government response to energy affordability injustices during the 1970s energy crisis served as pseudo-recognition. Out of that recognition came the 2 longest running energy assistance programs in the country. The Weatherization Assistance Program, which was authorized in 1976, provides low-income families with no to low-cost energy efficiency upgrades, and the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, LIHEAP, authorized in 1981, provides homes energy bill assistance to help subsidize their high energy expenditures. Moreover, in 1978, the National Energy Conservation Policy Act established the Office of Minority Economic Impact within the U.S. Department of Energy to advise on the effect of energy policies, regulations, and other actions on minorities, minority business enterprises, and minority educational institutions. Now, this office was also set up to establish an ongoing research program to determine the effects, including socioeconomic and environmental effects, of energy policies and regulations on minorities, and to develop and recommend policies to assist minorities. I was blown away that in 1978, the US federal government set up such an office. Now, this research was to include things like the average energy consumption and use patterns of minority populations relative to other populations, the percentage of disposable income spent on energy by minorities relative to other populations, and how programs, policies, and actions of the Department of Energy affect those patterns and consumption. Now, in 2019, then candidate Joe Biden campaigned on issues of racial, environmental, and economic justice. As president, he signed a host of executive orders in his first week and thereafter to advance these issues across the federal government. Specific to energy justice, I want to focus on Executive Order 14008, tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. It established what became known as the Justice 40 Initiative, which said that at least 40% of the overall benefits of clean energy and climate investments must accrue to disadvantaged communities. Now, disadvantaged communities, again, is another term to identify communities that were facing a combination of economic, health, and environmental burdens. You can see the small map at the bottom right of the slide with shaded census tracts that were classified as disadvantaged based on a host of characteristics to the right: climate issues, energy issues, health issues. About 30% of all US Census tracts and 28% of the population fell into this disadvantaged category. And by October 2023, all federal agencies were required to use this map in their programming. Now, remember that Office of Minority Impact from 1978? My colleague Shalonda Baker and I were fortunate to be a part of the leadership of that office, and we jumped into action with the renewed focus on equity and justice. We finally established the research office that was laid out in 1978, and I was honored to propose the new Office of Energy Justice Policy and Analysis in 2021 and officially launched that office in March of 2022 to create a federal hub for energy justice thought leadership. We published 5 peer-reviewed articles, 2 national reports, 1 book chapter, all within the first year. Later in 2023, we renamed our larger office to the Office of Energy Justice and Equity. We pushed for an energy earthshot that focused on energy affordability, while all the other earthshots were technically specific to things like hydrogen and carbon. We argued that affordable, efficient homes was one of the biggest barriers to tackling the climate crisis. Lastly, after 3 years, we were able to advance through the Department of Energy and all of its office in energy and environmental justice policy to institutionalize topics of energy and environmental justice and offer a path for righting the wrongs of an energy system that had disproportionately impacted Indigenous and Native Americans, Alaska Natives, Black, Brown, rural communities, low-income communities, and other disadvantaged communities across the US. So we used our words, we listened to folks, we embedded their thoughts, their cultures, and values into our policies, and we conducted the relevant research to support their needs. But I have to acknowledge that in the US, we are in a place of retreat and retrenchment when it comes to everything that I just mentioned that we did during the Biden-Harris administration. The Conservative Project 2025 document cited all of our work that the office was doing, calling for the Department of Energy to focus on energy and science issues, not politicized social programs, to stop using energy policy to advance politicized social agendas, saying that programs that sound innocuous, such as energy justice, Justice 40, and DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, can be transformed to promote politicized agenda. They go on to say that the Department of Energy should focus on providing all Americans with access to abundant, affordable, reliable, and secure energy. which is exactly what our innocuous programs were trying to do. Donald Trump did not waste any time turning this conservative document into his policy for the federal government once elected. On his first day in office, among his 26 executive orders, the most of any president in U.S. history, he issued executive order ending radical and wasteful government DEI programs and preferences, which terminated offices focused on DEI, environmental justice, and positions similar to that, equity action plans, equity actions, and so on, essentially putting an end to the Justice 40 initiative and the Energy Justice Office at the Department of Energy. But we remain resolved in our efforts to move toward equity-centered language, both in the US and abroad. So how do we get there? First, we must move away from individualized terms, stop labeling people as the poor or hard to reach. These words place the burden or responsibility on the households rather than the systems that have been failing them. Second, we should adopt structural framings. Terms like underserved or seldom heard highlight systemic neglect and political deprioritization. They point to the institutions and the policies that drive inequities. And third, we must co-produce our vocabularies, engage communities in defining the language of energy justice. Examples include New Zealand's participatory energy hardship indicators and the US-based Energy Equity Project framework are models of building metrics with, not for, communities. This is not just semantics. It's about shifting power. Language can either reinforce existing hierarchies or challenge them. Now, let me return to that family in Detroit. Imagine if instead of being called energy poor, they were recognized as underserved citizens whose rights to affordable, clean energy are being denied. That shift in language changes everything. It reframes them not as passive victims, but as active participants in a struggle for justice. So here's my call to action during this Global Energy Justice Action Week. If we want bold and equitable global action, we must first change the words we use. Because words don't just describe reality, they shape it. And energy justice begins not with technology, but with the language we choose to honor human dignity. So let's listen. Listen to those closest to the problem, because they're often closest to the solution. The photos on the right are from one leg of our 2023 Energy Justice to the People Roadshow, where we left the confines of our brutalist architectural federal headquarters in Washington, D.C., to immerse ourselves in communities on the front line of energy and justice. From town halls to walking tours to living rooms, the sights, stories, and lessons, the words used by those in those communities will inform my work and my words forever. Thank you for your time today, and I'm happy to be with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tony, for that insightful, keynote. And I strongly agree that we need more emphasis on the structural framings of the language. So, yeah, we will leave the Q&A session so in the end. So, up next, we will hear from the Dr. Diana Hermans at the Columbia University. Diana is a leading expert on energy insecurity and its links to the housing and health. Also, she just started a new role recently as the Climate Justice Fellow at the Harvard University. Diana, over to you. If you're ready, you can, yeah, share your screen now.
Good morning, everyone. Given that it's 8:30 in the morning and Tony just kicked us off in such a strong way, I'm so excited to be here. I've been asked to give some comments also on this use of terminology, and I want to kind of introduce some terminology, and then talk a little bit about work that I've been doing of late. Um, Thank you to the organizers for putting us together and really thinking about this as a global issue. I think we are long past the point where we should be coming together as a global community. I want to acknowledge Neil Simkaku, I know is also on the call. Several years ago, we wrote, and actually this was stemming from a conference that we had in Scotland, which was the first time that I met Tony in person. And this issue around concepts and language were coming up then. And I want to start with the notion that how we think about energy issues, energy related hardships, and the solutions in many ways may have some kind of universal qualities around the world. But I think that there's also space for thinking about how these issues surface, emerge, and where the solutions are that are a little bit more local. Sometimes we think that we need these kind of silver bullet terms or silver bullet kind of methodologies to move ahead. But in some ways, actually, what we may need are some agreements and then also some space to be able to describe issues that are very kind of driven by the local realities. So, and thinking about this particular paper that we wrote together, we tried to lay out how, this kind of status of terminologies exist, how are they defined, what aspect of hardship is prioritized, if that's affordability or the physical nature of housing, for instance, or something more upstream or more multidimensional? Is it dynamic? Is it more static, kind of temporally? Where are these concepts kind of proliferating? What are the disciplines that are driving this? One of the issues around energy is that we're speaking to these issues, but coming in from different disciplines. And I think that that's both a real strength, but also one of those issues where translation of concepts becomes more challenging. And where is the work situated? Who is having kind of a um, a voice, as Tony was describing, but also thinking about like academia as also being the arbiter of inequalities, and who has voice and who has kind of a platform. So this was our kind of attempt at that point to kind of just lay out what were some of the terms that were kind of most widely used, and how do they compare to each other, and are they actually comparable? And I really want to congratulate the authors on this perspective that came out just this year, and I think is kicking off so much of the work that you all are doing here and inspiring that work. Because it really starts to call into question, what are we, how are we describing issues? How are we measuring issues? Whose perspective is most prioritized? And I think ultimately, how does that kind of lead to change, right? Ultimately, this really should be about not only critiquing language, but also how does that set us up for thinking about who's responsible for making shifts? Who's responsible for what are we aiming toward when it comes to equity? What are we aiming toward when it comes to kind of framing the strategy? And really kind of what's the long game with respect to research and action. And I want to really get to where some of my concerns in this space are. And it's not necessarily related to the questions that are raised in that perspective, but more broadly about how we kind of think about situating problems versus solutions. As we think about this from a global perspective, the kind of the North and South divides, where the realities are very different sometimes. And how do we frame and prioritize all of the dimensions of justice, right? From recognition justice, procedural distribution, but also restorative justice. How is restorative justice really the end goal, and how do we achieve it? Um, and so this is another way of thinking about that spectrum of terminology. And in some ways, the kind of not just the origin story of it. So, I mean, we don't even include fuel poverty in here, but we could and really think about that as an origin for the field. But also, how do these terms matter for what we're ultimately, like the goal is, and how do we do our work? And I kind of situate my work in two of these terms. The first one being around energy insecurity. And the insecurity for me has always been important, in part because it is about understanding that people may enter and exit the realities of being unable to adequately meet their household energy needs, but also that there are kind of externalities, and some of that is driven by, other people that are making decisions about climate change, and also about the kind of challenges in being part of the solutions, right? I think that that's kind of a recognition that's important, because even though we may aspire toward that, there are some challenges in who gets to be involved and who gets to participate. And then one of the other ways that we've been working and kind of trying to find synergies between the global north and the global south, what are lessons learned across these kind of boundaries, quote unquote, um, how do we kind of engage in a more participatory fashion? And, how do we actually leverage what is changing in the energy space in a way that is beneficial to communities that have long kind of contended with the problem side of energy? And so I wanted to just talk a little bit about the book that I just published, called Powerless: The People Struggle for Energy, and acknowledge my co-author, Jennifer Laird. And I know I am probably, when I read the medicalization, part of that five point critique. As a public health person, I am guilty as charged for talking about these in medical terms, or using health related concepts as a kind of an anchor. And in many ways, there's a rationale for that. One is that health has traditionally been more kind of bipartisan, and has not necessarily had the same kind of levels of contestation that, just other forms of equity and justice related to socioeconomic position, race, place, etc., have been, very contentious. And there are, economic realities around health. And so this is another reason. Thanks, Tony, guys. We're all guilty. Anyway, I wanted to just kind of say that the work that I've done has been very much rooted in, conversation and deep engagement with people that are experiencing these hardships, and, wanting to like kind of understand how this unfolds. How do we think in more deep terms about the economic hardships? How do we think in more precise terms around what physical dimensions of, kind of energy hardships, energy insecurity exists? And then all of the work. And to me, when we think about who's giving, like how are people kind of given credit for their management of these realities, it's actually in all of the ways that they're coping and trading off and making decisions and being really active, in a more proximal way around, their response to the conditions, but also in a way that really demonstrates that there's a lot of work involved in managing these circumstances. And sometimes, that work is so heavy that it makes it a little bit harder to kind of, be involved on the solution side. It's not to say that there aren't important contributions to be made there. But it's also acknowledging that sometimes, like, that the immediacy of, contending with bills that are unpayable, et cetera, like sometimes takes up so much effort and so much work. And that's kind of a limiting factor that we also have to think about, what are the structural solutions to alleviate folks from that? And then thinking about, well, what's the felt experience? How do we think about this in the same terms that we understand food insecurity around hunger and malnutrition, and using, participants as actual words, thinking about it as drain. So it's draining psychologically, financially, physiologically to deal with these issues and depletion. And so I'm going to go more quickly on this, but again, a focus on measurement. One of the ways in which, having a more limited way of describing issues and, thinking about it just as an income to expenditure ratio, for instance, doesn't get at some of these more experientially based ways in which, people experience not just one, but cumulative indicators or experiences of these energy related hardships. And I'm using that as kind of the cover for all the things that we are thinking about. Of course, my focus is in the US, and this is a ratio. But when you think about it, it's really millions of households that are contending with these issues in the US. And the patterns around inequality are so stark and clear, consistent: race, income, education, household composition, housing types, and age of household, where the homes are located, also really matter. And also kind of thinking more systemically about, well, what are the possibilities right now, and what should be there, what should be on the table. So part of it is the assessment around what are the policy solutions that exist, what are the resources that exist, and really, like, where are they falling short. And also kind of anchoring that in the ways that we think about the way forward. And a big part of what my book does is it reframes. So, like, on the one hand, naming matters, and how we kind of talk about concepts um is important, but also, like, what's the framing and what's the vision? And when I think about the kind of visions for where, again, this is very domestically focused, but, like, right now we have tattered umbrellas, right? We have basically, people that are turning for help when they need it, and they have essentially kind of uh, semi-useless umbrella, on the one hand, and then a hand out for more help because it just really isn't enough. And I think about umbrellas as being really important for the framing of this because coverage, if you think about the best case scenario around insurance coverage, healthcare coverage, that kind of thing, it's really about grounding and the importance of not necessarily like a safety net that helps people when they fall, but also something that really allows people to stand grounded and in their power and still, like, be able to function, but have actual cover to do so. And so the naming and the framing pieces are important along with the blaming parts. So really understanding who is responsible for the conditions that, and the shortfalls in, the kind of current, structure around resources and benefits. And then, what is the claiming part? So one of my earliest papers really talks about this naming, blaming, claiming, which is a socio-legal term, but I think the framing part is sometimes missed, and really critical for thinking about the visions. This is the action framework that comes out of the book, and arguably this is meant to be like pick up where we are right now. It is not necessarily about, like, I think Shalonda and Tony were really, like, doing amazingly ambitious and visionary work while at the DOE. I think this is much more like, how do we understand this right now? How do we kind of make steps in the more immediate terms as we are kind of gearing up toward more ambitious approaches. And I really want to kind of end on this notion of like, why is it important to name something? Why is it important to frame it important, like in a more accurate way? Like, what is our goal on human terms? Like, and for me, that is a feeling. That's a feeling of comfort. It's a feeling of health. It's a feeling of dignity. It's a feeling of human connection that's afforded by these opportunities for living in comfort and, having affordable utilities for participating in the clean energy transition, for thinking about community well-being. I think particularly in the context of climate change. And thinking about how do we redefine resilience? Resilience is a big responsibility and a big charge that yet again falls on the shoulders of the people that are most impacted. How do we think about security as kind of an antidote to that? In many ways, to create the pathways by which people could live their biggest and most ambitious and most truest potentials in life. And so with that, I'll stop and happy to turn it back over to Lynn. You're muted.
Yeah, I just realized. Thank you so much, Diana, for the compelling perspective. Yeah, that's really fascinating. So next we will welcome Marilyn Smith from the Energy Action Project. Marilyn works on the ground to support energy vulnerable communities and bring research into action. Marilyn, it's all yours. I think so I will share my screen now, and please let me know if you want to change the page. 1 second.
Great. Thanks very much, Lynn. I'm letting Lynn share my PowerPoint because my system crashes regularly when I try to share from my own
No
system.
worries.
So
Bear me
you'll be hearing okay, click, click, click. But I wanted to just take a minute to introduce myself because some of you know me and some of you don't. I see quite a few names that I don't recognize in the participants. So I launched the Energy Action Project about 10 years ago. And my background is as a journalist and then as a science writer and then as chief editor at the International Energy Agency. And during all of that time, I became more and more aware of how important energy is to daily life and to economies and societies, and then how if you don't have access to energy, you can't afford energy, it really is debilitating in many, many ways. So I kind of think of myself as someone who, as a writer, I'm very interested in words, as an energy communicator also. But increasingly over the last 3 or 4 years, I've been more involved in leading action in my own community or with partners in other countries to tackle energy poverty. And so I've become more directly connected with people who are experiencing situations where energy prices make their daily lives very difficult. And so I'm going to dive into some of the things that have been talked about already, and go into some of the, really kind of the experience that I'm having with people in this situation. As I alluded to, I don't come from an academic background, but I want to talk to you from my experience with people in these situations. So if you could switch to the next slide. The first term, the first term that I want to talk about is hard to reach consumers, and I'm glad that Tony, you brought this up earlier because I was a little nervous about being the first one to bring it up. And if you could just click again, Lynn. So for me, the term hard to reach consumers is I get why it's used in academic circles, but with the women that I've been working with lately, I think the minute they saw themselves referred to that, they would be quite insulted and quite angry, and they would probably disconnect from engaging with me. And so I think, what we need to be able to move to is the consumers who we are not yet connecting with. It isn't that they're hard to reach. To me, that feels like, somebody who doesn't listen to me or somebody who won't engage. And what really we need to do is figure out how do we connect with these people. And one of the lessons that I would bring from photojournalism, which I do, and which I'm connected to a number of photojournalists, is that if you want to get good photos, you have to go stand in front of interesting things. And I think this is exactly true for understanding the people who are being affected by high energy prices and the systems that make energy extremely costly for them. We need to go stand close enough to hear them, not expect that they're going to suddenly show up where we are. And we also need to be careful of not asking them to reveal information before they're ready to reveal it. And in the photojournalism or journalism world, we do this a lot. And we've made some documentary films, and always the first time that we go and meet people, we leave our cameras at home. We don't go and expect to photograph them the first time we meet them. We just want them to get to know who we are before we start asking them who they are. And so I think this is, sort of a second lesson from photojournalism. And this is, the second bullet point that has come up here. We really need to start by creating social links that break the isolation and build trust. Yeah. And the other point that often we hear a lot about is who are the most vulnerable households. And this is definitely true in the EU just energy transition. Sorry, this going a little bit faster than I wanted.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. So who are the most vulnerable households? And, the just energy transition says we want to make sure we're dealing with the most vulnerable households first. And at the EU level, that is very, very attached to renovating the worst quality homes. And with the project that I am currently leading, the Women in Solidarity for Energy project, which is funded by the EU under the Citizens Equality Rights and Values project, I want to just share some statistics. And the first one, Lynn, if you could just click again, is the one we all know. I just happened to give this presentation in French a couple of days ago. So across the EU, the average of households in some degree of energy precarity is 8 to 10%. But if you disaggregate the data, and Lynn, if you could click again, and look only at single women, which we define as any woman who is solely responsible for the energy, for managing resources in her household. So it might be young students or young professionals away from home for the first time, single mothers, elderly women who are on their own, or migrant women who have come alone. So if you disaggregate, the data I showed before by just gender, it shows that 31% of single women-led households are experiencing energy precarity. If you click again, Lynn, and you look at the single mothers, that number jumps to 44%. So in Europe, almost half of single mothers are experiencing daily difficulties because of the high costs of energy. And so the WISE program, I think if you click one more, the white WISE logo might come up. Yeah. So what we're doing across in 7 countries across 2 years is we're hosting a number of events to raise awareness of these data, and then to host workshops for women that are experiencing this kind of situation. And then we will also have some solidarity actions within the project, and we will have some final events to tell everybody what we managed to accomplish in a couple of years. And if you could go to the next slide. Yeah, so here's just a breakdown of what the WISE project is. So as I said, raise awareness of energy injustices experienced by single women, organize energy solidarity actions to build up energy knowledge and know-how. And we use those terms quite specifically, that people need to know, women need to know about energy, and they also need to know how to use energy. So, we often hear that energy literacy, and we want to make sure women know both parts. And actually just recently I had a call from a woman whose electricity had been cut off. And what was important for her in that moment to know is what the law is here in France. And because her energy provider had done all the processes they needed to do, they did have the right to cut her off. But what she was very scared of was calling another supplier and having to admit that she is in arrears with her past supplier. And the law does not allow the new supplier to know that. So all she had to say to the new supplier is, I want to change suppliers because I'm unsatisfied with my previous one. And then she had to go back to her previous supplier and work out a repayment plan. But she did not have to tell the new supplier that she was in arrears. And so that made her really comfortable in calling the new supplier and saying, I just want to change. And she didn't have to reveal any more information than that. So ultimately, what WISE wants to do is lead holistic approaches to align policy and practice to eradicate energy poverty among women. And the important element here is the vast majority of these women are not eligible for the renovation strategies that everybody is pushing to aid the most vulnerable people because they're not homeowners. And even if they were homeowners, they would not have the finances necessary to put money up front to get the subventions, subsidies that a homeowner would be eligible for. So a really main aspect of WISE is to understand what these women really need and how we can put policies in place and actions at the local level to make sure that in the local context, somebody is taking care of these women. I think it's very difficult to do that at a national or EU level because the situations are so different. It happens that we're doing it here in France in my own community, which is Aubervilliers. It's a suburb of Paris, and it is the second poorest city in France. So the level of energy poverty is really high, and there's a long history of why it's so high. So this situation here is very different from what it would be, somewhere in the south of France where summers are hot. Okay, so just quickly, we're doing WISE in Bulgaria, Croatia, France, Greece, Hungary, Italy, and the Netherlands, and we're about a little more than halfway through the project. And so we are in the phase of doing energy workshops with women. If you could go to the next slide. So this is another term that I really hate hearing, give vulnerable people a voice. And if you could click again, Lynn, and just click a couple of times, I think again, so we don't need to give these people a voice. They have voices, but what we can do is amplify the voices of unheard people. And if you can click again, as I said, they have a voice. What we have that they lack is platforms and channels and networks. So let's just be realistic about what we're doing for them. And it's great that you've clicked through, and you can click through one more time here, Lee. We recently participated again in French in a competition to get some funding for a media-related project that would be related to the WISE project. And what we proposed, and as I said before, we've done some documentary films about people in energy precarity, and we've done some photo essays, and we wanted to do that again. But from our past experience, we recognized that it's very difficult to find people who will let you come into their homes, and it takes a lot of time, and it's very costly if you're paying professional photographers and videographers to do this. So we proposed taking a completely different approach, which was to do a workshop where we taught women in my neighborhood again how to use their own phones to photograph their own lives. So what we did, we showed them a PowerPoint presentation where we said, well, this is how we approach it. And the example that these two photos here, you can see is a woman in Ukraine. And you can't see it very well, but the photo on the left shows that she has only one gas connection in her house, and that's the only heat source in her house. So often she stands with her back against the wall that is heated by that one gas connection. But she talked to us about having arthritis in her feet and rheumatism in her feet. So we took a detailed picture of her feet. We've got the broad picture and we've got the detailed picture. So we said to the women, this is one of the things that you can do to tell your story in your home. Tell the big story, tell the detailed story. And if you could click again. Then we showed them how to use their smartphones more strategically to, pick the thing you want to focus on, to use I used the flash, use the timer, all of those things. And if you could click once more, then we had them do some photos around the venue that we were in. And if you can click to the next. So this is Hayat. And the look on her face was, we have a video where she's doing this, but she has taken this photo and suddenly she literally jumps with joy because she can see that she has taken a photo that is so much better than anything she's done before. She achieved what she wanted to do in this photo, and she showed the situation that she wanted to show. And so this was with a group of about 6 women, and it was so fun to see them. First of all, to watch us show the photos we had done, because we could see immediately that they were recognizing details in other people's houses that reflected their own house or their own daily situation or the struggles that they faced. So already they could see, oh yeah, I could take that picture, I could take that picture. And then because we gave them the practical tips, then they knew how to take those pictures. But what was really remarkable is at the end of this workshop, we sat down and had lunch with these women. And they were incredibly open about what their situations are. And the reality is, we often come to them and say, we're going to teach you how to save energy at home, or we're going to teach you how to understand your energy bills. And the very first thing they said to us is, don't tell us how to save energy at home, because we don't use energy, or we turn energy on when we need it, and then we turn it off. And Hayat is an example of this. Because she's in arrears on payments, she is on the low voltage tariff. And if she turns 2 things off on in her apartment at once, everything, the fuse box jumps. So she has to strategically turn at the fuse box level things on and off when she wants to use them. She only turns her hot water tank on every couple of days to do the things that she needs hot water for. And so when you sit down and listen to these people, you realize they're really strategic, and they really understand their own energy systems in a way that I've never had to think about, how am I going to not have my disjunctor, my fuse box jump. So what we're doing in this project is working with the women to take their own photos, and we are going to do a photo-based project that lets them tell their stories, and we will use our networks, our connections, our distribution channels to amplify their stories rather than us going into their homes and telling their stories. If you could click through to the next. Energy experts is also a term that, of course, we are energy experts, but what has made the difference for me to work in my community is to just show up, participate in the things that these women do, and make them aware that I understand energy and I have connections in the energy community. I'm just a person in their community who works in energy. And if you could click through again, Lynn, I think there's probably 2 that you can click through. So what I want them to know is that I have knowledge and connections that they can tap into. And this is exactly what happened in the situation where I said I got a phone call from this woman whose electricity had been disconnected. I didn't know for sure the answers that she needed, so I called an energy company and asked. And within an hour, I could call this woman back and say, okay, here's the answers to your questions, because I know who to call. And she was so scared to call anybody because she didn't want any new energy company to know, what her real situation was. And then, as I alluded to a bit earlier, what's really important is I'm somebody who's going to acknowledge your knowledge, your resourcefulness, and your resilience. And they, as I said, they're super resourceful and super resilient. One of the things that these women do is they belong to a local, I'm having trouble thinking of the word. It's just a community space that is run by a nonprofit association. One of the things it has is a professional kitchen. So a number of these women every Tuesday or whenever they get the opportunity to be the caterer to an event, they meet at this kitchen and they all cook together and they all earn a little bit of income from it. But what's more important to them is they are able to take home whatever food is left over from the event. And so this is one of the ways that they are really resilient. If they're going to that kitchen on a Tuesday to cook for an event, they'll cook for their family for several days so that they can avoid turning their ovens on at home. So we really just need to acknowledge how incredibly smart and resilient and resourceful these people are. And I think I have one more slide, or I might be at the end. Oh yeah, stakeholder. This is a word that only really came into, well, of course we talk about energy stakeholders and energy poverty stakeholders all the time, and it denotes the type of organization or system in which all members or participants have an interest in the success of whatever's going on. So we have an interest in energy justice, we have an interest in energy equity. But recently I was talking to a woman who is a founder of an organization in Uganda called the Rape Hurts Foundation. And she used a term that I have absolutely never heard anybody else use. And if you click one more time, Lynn, I am so interested in exploring this term more deeply. It's the duty holder. So to me, this is the type of, it's the organization or system or entity that has an obligation to the citizens affected, which implies setting up the frameworks under which other stakeholders should engage. So this is, as I said, this is kind of a new term to me, and I really want to think more about who holds the duty and what steps do they need to take to make sure that people have access to energy in an affordable way. Lynn, I've kind of lost track of time, so if I'm running out, please let me know. I have one more slide that I want to talk about. Do I have time for one more?
Nope. Yeah, you can maybe just have 1 or 2 minutes wrap up.
Okay,
Yeah,
perfect. I can do this in 2 minutes. So France, I'm exceptionally lucky to be working in France and you can just click through to the other parts of the slide, and then I'll know. So Stop à l'exclusion énergétique is this really massive program to tackle energy poverty in a very holistic way in France. The duty holder is the government, so the government put money behind launching Stop à l'exclusion énergétique. It now has a stakeholder group of more than 50 members and partners that aim to bring social, environmental, and health benefits, creating dignity, well-being, quality of life, value, and employment. So what's really interesting to me is the huge range of partners. It's everybody from energy companies to the biggest hardware store to renovation companies. Like, it's just such a huge number of different entities. And not once do they use the phrase energy precarity or energy fuel poverty or energy poverty. That what they want to do is stop the exclusion of people because of energy problems, the way the energy systems are set up. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Marilyn, for introducing and sharing those experiences from the WISE and Energy Action Project. So I'm gonna to stop here and thank you. So our next speaker is Dr. Shuchen Cong from Dartmouth College's Arthur L. Irving Institute for Energy and Society. Shuchen's research focuses on social structures and hidden energy inequalities in households. Shuchen, if you're ready, you can share your screen now.
In 1 second.
Okay.
Oh. Okay, there we go.
Yeah, we can see your screen now.
Okay, perfect. Well, great to meet everybody. I'm very honored to be among this company. I'm Shu Chen from the Irving Institute for Energy and Society at Dartmouth. And today I want to talk about how we measure energy hardship, because the metrics we've been using to identify struggling households may be missing the people who need help the most. So let me start with a story that's unfolding right now. This is Justina Ray, a preschool teacher in Jenkintown, Pennsylvania. She has 2 kids and a cat named Flounder. And for nearly a decade, Justina had relied on LOHEAP, the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, to help heat her home. So her situation is already very tight. During the winter, her disposable income drops because of holiday spendings and because her kids are home from school closures. But the U.S. government shutdown has delayed LOHEAP funding across the U.S. So when NPR interviewed her last month, she said, "Without LOHEAP, I really don't know what I'm going to do." So what is she doing? She told the reporter that her family plans to bundle up rather than turn on the heat, and think about what that means in practice. So extra blankets to begin with, of course. Maybe leaving the oven door open for warmth, which is very dangerous. Maybe she would use a space heater in only one room and they would all gather there together. She could delay when she turns on the furnace and choose between food or heating. And the consequences really cascade from that point. She might be forced to skip holiday traditions with her kids. She might risk missing car payments. She might face increased illness from cold exposure. If someone gets sick, that means medical bills, missed work, and potentially damaged credit. For her children, it could mean school absences, difficulty concentrating, and all of this because energy is not affordable, which would all have larger impacts on Justina's life than being cold. And Justina is now a common occurrence rather than an outlier. In Pennsylvania alone, over 300,000 families rely on LOHEAP every year. And nationwide, that's almost 6 million households. This map here shows LOHEAP recipients per 100,000 households in each state. And the darker the color, the higher the share of households receiving assistance. And we can see that the regional pattern here is quite distinct. The Northeast states obviously have the higher reliance and makes sense given the heating costs in cold climates. And we also see high rates in parts of the South and Midwest where lower incomes are combined with higher cooling needs. And the scale here ranges from about 200 to 6,000 households per 100,000. That means in some states, roughly 1 in 17 households depend on this program. And the situation this year is particularly dire. States are, as I said, experiencing a delay in disbursement of funding due to the government shutdown. And then federal LOHEAP staff were all let go this spring. And the infrastructure for helping these families is strained at exactly the moment that they need it the most. So if this is an example of why we need to rethink our metrics. Looking at these 2 households, household A earns $80,000 a year. They keep their thermostats at a comfortable 72 degrees all summer, pays about $200 a month for energy, and their energy burden is 3%. Household B, on the other hand, earns $35,000. They don't turn on their AC until it's 85 degrees, and their bill is only $87 a month. Their energy burden is also 3%. Which household has the higher energy burden? They're the same, but obviously household B faces greater hardship. They're rationing their cooling to keep costs down, but their income is just above the eligibility level for LOHEAP, leaving them unqualified for assistance. Yet our primary policy metric treats them identically. So energy burden matters a lot, and we definitely should continue to use it. It can capture unaffordable costs, identify geographic disparities, helps target bill assistance, and it can track affordability over time. But there are also things that it cannot detect. We have self-imposed energy rationing. We have health impacts from underheating or undercooling, quality of life sacrifices, the timing of when hardship hits during the year, coping strategies people adopt, and we also have the risks of dangerous alternatives like space heaters or ovens. And most importantly, it misses hidden vulnerability, households that look efficient on paper, but are actually depriving themselves. So this is where energy limiting behavior comes in. This is what happens when households can't afford adequate heating or cooling, and they resort to enduring discomfort to save money, often to make way for other necessities. So they adapt, they delay turning on the heat or AC, they set more extreme temperatures than they prefer, and they may turn off systems overnight, or they heat or cool only one room. And the result is lower energy consumption that looks efficient. If you look at the graph here that shows the daily electricity consumption on the vertical axis and the corresponding daily average temperature on the horizontal axis. The gray line is a temperature response function of a lower income household compared to the red line of a higher income household. The lower income family uses less energy per increase in temperature, and it shows as a flatter curve, which looks like efficiency, but the reality is deprivation. Then we also look at the temperature at which a household starts using their AC, which is labeled by the stars here. And in our studies, we found that in the same region, higher income households often have lower cooling balance points, and lower income homes wait till it's hotter to start cooling. And the gap between these temperatures become the energy equity gap. And here is the evidence. So in Arizona, we analyzed 4 years of smart meter data from over 6,000 households. And the key finding was that lower income households waited 4.7 to 7.5 degrees Fahrenheit longer before turning on their cooling compared to higher income neighbors. And this wasn't because of building characteristics or AC efficiency or household size. We controlled for all of those factors. This is behavioral adaptation to their financial constraint. Looking at this diagram on the right, it shows the overlap between households identified by high energy burden in the orange circle versus our behavioral metric, households that wait till it's 78 degrees or higher to start using their AC in the purple circle. And out of over 4,500 households, only 3 were captured by both, having a high energy burden and delayed cooling behavior. And these metrics, as we see, are identifying almost entirely different populations. So this wasn't just in Arizona. We ended up replicating these findings across a couple of different climates and regions. On the left, we see Chicago from 2020 to 2021, similar pattern, lower income groups delay cooling. They have higher medium cooling balance points. And on the right here, a mid-Atlantic state in 2018, again, lower income homes displaying smaller cooling slopes, which is they spend less energy per degree increase in temperature. And the relationship between energy limiting behavior, both delayed cooling, heating versus sustained limiting behavior in cooling and heating throughout the seasons. It's not only robust, but also pretty consistent. So what does this mean for policy? So we could think of it as a matrix of energy burden and cooling behavior, just as an example. And these 2 dimensions are definitely not the only ones. There have been many other metrics that complements or improves energy burden. I'm sure folks in the audience are developing comprehensive and adaptive metrics for your own communities. So just take this as an example on how we can incorporate these. So in quadrant 1, we have high energy burden and high limiting behavior. These households face acute vulnerability and they need comprehensive support immediately. And in quadrant 2, we have low burden but high limiting behavior. This is hidden deprivation. Their bills may look manageable, but it's because they're depriving themselves. They need weatherization, health monitoring, and direct intervention. And in quadrant 4, we have high burden but adequate comfort relatively. These households are spending too much but maintaining comfort, and they primarily need bill assistance. And the point is, these different metrics identify different people who need different interventions. And using only energy burden means we're missing an entire population of vulnerable households. And that's both when we look at eligibility and when we measure program performance. Let's go back to Justina. So if we look at only her energy burden and income, we see that she qualifies for assistance, and when funding arrives, we'll either send her a check or pay her utility directly. But if we also look at her behavior, we could detect that she's delaying heating, using her oven for warmth potentially, and exposed to cold. We would also identify additional health risks, and we'd know to prioritize her case. We could offer weatherization to reduce her long-term need and not just one-time bill assistance that doesn't really solve the problem. And it's also subject to volatile environment of funding as we're seeing. And the bottom line is measurement determines who we see, and who we see determines who we help. But ultimately, we really kid ourselves if we think money is not the main problem and also the main solution. And to change the wealth inequality and making sure no one is left behind requires an overhaul of our systems over generations. Where do we go from here? On the research side, we are looking to expand geographic coverage. We can link behavioral data to health outcomes and test which interventions actually work. We also want to think about how we distinguish energy-saving behavior from energy-limiting behavior, so we can understand how to identify those markers and usage data, and how to incentivize people to save energy, but not at a cost of comfort or safety. And on the policy side, we can link behavior to pre and post weatherization consumption patterns. We can integrate behavioral metrics into assistance programs. We can use the granular smart meter data that we already have for targeted outreach. And we can update the LAHEAP funding formulas that's used to calculate how much money each state gets that were designed in the 1970s and 80s for today's climate realities. And we have the infrastructure, we have smart meters, and we have the analytical methods. Now it's just about implementation. Thank you so much. Thank you to Lynn and the organizers, and my email is on the screen if you'd like to reach out to me. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Shuchen. Fascinating presentation, and thank you for bringing so much more lessons of the US context. So our next speaker is Dr. Andrews Estevez from the Economic and Social Research Institute in Ireland. So Andrews studies anti-poverty and policy with a particular focus on social inequality in Europe. Over to you, Andrews.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for being here, for the invitation. It's such a pleasure to be among such honorable presenters. I will, knowing that we would be lucky enough to count with their presence, I built my presentation around their work. So I will now share my screen. I hope you can see it now. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Oh. So, and like that, can you still see it? Or is it not the expanded version?
Yeah, not spent version. Yeah.
Is the expanded version?
No, not the spent version.
And now?
Yes, now it works. Yeah,
okay, perfect. Thank you. So what I will be presenting is a critical analysis of the Energy Poverty and Affordability Report, which is part of our work, and it's forthcoming. The idea came about after the presenters and everything that we were doing here became more clear. So the idea is to use my work, co-authored with Miguel Ángel Tovar, and the contemporary Irish context as an example to analyze, just like to consider insights from critical theory, social policy, and political philosophy, to see like how language is shaping our work. I will present to you the context from the Energy Poverty and Affordability Report and the presentation as was communicated to stakeholders. I will focus on discussing the language, the methods, and will ignore the results. The opinions, of course, that I share here are more my own, like a self-criticism, and are not, part of the employer. So if you want to know more about what we are doing here, I will call your attention to the research program in energy poverty. What I will be presenting is part of it, and it's a multi-stakeholder initiative that includes the Central Statistics Office, the Department of Energy and Climate, Energy and Communications now, who fund our work. So we are tasked with analyzing energy poverty and provide solutions. We're like working very closely with the government on this. And this is a little bit where I come from. So building on everything that Tony and the others have explained now much better than I could have done myself, I would also like just to share with you what's in the back of my mind and what never goes into a report when I'm writing and studying these issues, even as I was tasked with this report, you know, because I believe that uh, we should be aware of how language can be inappropriate, inaccurate, or problematic, and we should act accordingly. So some of well-known theorists that call like that speak to this issue are, for example, Pierre Bourdieu, which will say that how we measure things are like symbolic power, and defining poor, for example, is a way to establish social hierarchies. Foucault would be a little bit more aggressive in saying how measurement and categorizations are a tool of governance, talking about how his term, like using the biopolitical and expanding that term to say, talk about the regimes that produces the poor as an object of policy, so separating it and objectifying it. Then James C. Scott talking about how statistics make society legible by simplifying it, which is like a necessary tool for the state. Like people need to be visible for their state, but in that process, sometimes they become invisible as humans. So Escobar, on the other hand, talks something that is relevant for other contexts as well, which is that many poverty indicators, not only energy poverty, will reflect Western norms of progress and modernity, or Nancy Fraser, who will say that social justice requires both redistribution and recognition. So something that is more prevalent in our work today is, how we do recognize how some exclusions are operating along race, gender, and identity, although there's of course room for progress. So the practical issues, that we are faced as an institute or as a researcher that relate to language have are like very well summarized in the work of Tony and co-authors. So we can misidentify the drivers, what explains energy poverty, and then the solutions, which depend on the assessment, or to say clinically, diagnosis of the problem. The poor language that can facilitate overlooking structural issues, so it quickly becoming a criticism of something that is very big, like criticisms towards capitalism and such. It's been said also how they reinforce stigma and us versus them mentality, but there are also the trade-offs, right? The media attention and the policy relevance and the success that talking about energy poverty and using such a catchy term has allowed real issues and real experiences of hardship to come at the forefront and to gain the attention of policymakers that they rightfully deserve. So a parallel issue, but similar but not the same, is the issue of measurement, right? And here we can rely on the literature of well-being and poverty. Most of you will be aware with the work of Amartya Sen, Martha Nussbaum, Angus Deaton, and people like Alkire and Diana Ellison at the UN, who have done multi-dimensional indicators and stuff like this, precisely to say, like, okay, like all measures are imperfect. But especially single indicators, just using one indicators is bound to oversimplify any multidimensional experience, right? Such as energy poverty experiences. Then there is a trade-off of simplicity versus comprehensiveness. There are very important data limitation data limitations. We will shape the narrative and everything that we are doing. And there are also policy demands that sometimes we need to, respond to and work through because we're part of the system. So now I begin I will go through the presentation very quickly of how I would talk and present to stakeholders, but and then commenting upon it. So first, like the goal of the reports is to produce a multidimensional analysis on energy poverty and affordability. We'll do what we call structural analysis to see what other drivers might be causing it, like trying to precisely see this holistic vision. And then we're for the first time estimating or making an effort to estimate the severity of energy poverty experiences, and we build a case for targeted policy interventions and try to effectively communicate these policy recommendations and implications. So what is happening here already is that why are we calling it energy poverty and affordability? Why would we choose this title for this report, right? So part of the reason is politics, then there's policy inertia, there's funding, and there's a strategy on how to get our message and our agenda across. So for example, the shift towards affordability is something that is happening at least here in Ireland. It's a narrative shift that tries to respond to the funds that will come from the just transition and trying to bring that in as the language is now affordability and leaving a little bit behind energy poverty. Now, a problem that we as economists face, and like getting too technical, is that everything that we write is expecting to be proven with very robust evidence. We cannot argue with it, and it's very difficult or not well regarded to appeal to people's common sense, which is, I would say, a lot of the times very condescending. So then we provide the relevance and the policy context in this of this report. And here we talk about beyond the obvious need to tackle poverty and energy poverty. There are the EU directives and there are the national plans and the regulations and documents that the Irish government has put into this to address the demands that come from the European Commission. So the climate, energy and climate plans, and then now more recently we have an energy affordability task force here in Ireland. But so we need to here we see the need to justify our work, right? And we are already problematizing, and the narrative starts to be shaped. But this problematic is often established at the top. And we as researchers have to respond usually using that same language, or at least tend to finish doing that, at our own fault. What we do is then explain that Ireland has an official indicator, which is spending using more than 10% of your disposable income on energy expenditures. But then there are data limitations. Ireland can only measure this every 5 years, and that is inadequate for policy responses, to respond to shocks, to a huge spike in energy prices. And you will not be able, like the government won't be able to have an idea of how to act and when to act timely. And as we see, like these are very urgent, these are experiences that need very urgent responses sometimes. So then we start by saying, look, why don't you use the inability to afford adequate warmth indicator, which comes in yearly and it's subjective and it signals, like real affordability pressures, and it's more timely. So here we're already strategizing. That is a problem. But we are recognizing and encouraging a broader understanding of energy poverty experiences, as you will see here, because the European Commission suggests more than 10 well-established indicators, right? So we plot them all and we show how they vary in levels. Here to the right, you can see how they go from 3% to 20%. but most of them below 15%. And we have as well both the expenditure-based and the subjective or self-reported indicators. And here we're trying to hammer the message that energy poverty is experienced in multiple ways, and that the need for addressing a range, assessing a range of indicators is essential to try to capture the full extent of energy affordability issues. So when one collapses, makes these composite indicators or union indicators into one single indicators, we see that there's a little overlap, as Sushen showed us. The most indicators will say that that it's just like 1 in 10 households having a problem, but the reality is that actually 1 in 3 household is experiencing one type of these experiences. And normally households, as you will see if you do like a trend analysis, they jump from one experience to another. Sometimes they go out of the experience for 1 year and then they go back, but most of the time they're just jumping from what different indicators capture, because there's this whole behavioral responses, etc. But let me not get into that because we're talking about language. And at least what we are trying to do here is that to note how it is important to understand the size of the problem, to not look at a single indicator, right? And we start here to talk about affordability risk, right? And what is affordability risk? Just to keep it simple, is saying like you can assess affordability risk by at least considering everyone who falls into one of these categories as vulnerable to an energy poverty experience or vulnerable to energy poverty. Then the report also goes and plots all of these different indicators across all characteristics or all relevant characteristics that that we have access to. And I see that I am going short on time, so I'll try to be even faster. So we do address structural vulnerabilities and we argue for multiple indicators. We collapse them again, and then here with the energy poverty, the conditional energy poverty rates, we get a profile. But here we're kind of profiling already, right? And this is, one has to recognize that this is limited by the ability of the data that we have, right? The characteristics that are in these databases is what we can name, right? Then we do propose a framework to assess vulnerability and risks, similar to what Sushen proposed, because we look at the distribution. And then here you can understand who is high at risk, who's not so much at risk, who's medium risk, just by plotting different energy poverty thresholds or income poverty lines and see who is at most vulnerable, right? Obviously, those who have high energy expenditures and low incomes are the most at risk. And those who, for example, have but here you see that you can still be high at risk even if your expenditure is low and your income is relatively high. But it all depends on whether you're adapting your behavior. And there's, of course, people in different conditions who have different expenditures, and households optimize their expenditure depending on their needs, right? So this is like trying to hide it, trying to see that, trying to visualize that. Then there is this analysis that we do, which is basically just showing like how each of these measures shows who is vulnerable and who's not. What measures make which groups visible and invisible, and at the same time just like discuss basically what are the trade-offs of using one or the other, if you were to focus in one measure or in others. There are measures who capture very well the hidden poverty, but will, unfortunately, because of that, like misclassify some rich households, but who, because people are not living there, for example. But anyway, that is not the point here. But what are the policy lessons? What are we recommending? Where we are really advocating for a system that is comprehensive, a monitoring system that is used to collect the data and to look at least 3 indicators. And here we're kind of negotiating, but we're working on what's politically feasible. Then we also try to estimate the severity and cost of energy poverty. So using expenditure-based indicators, basically we go we ask the question, how much would it take to the household to exit that particular definition, which is has to do with your income and your expenditures. And with that, we come to a figure that is between 11 and 45 euros per week, depending on which measure you take, and then see how that varies across different groups. Here, well, it is an effort to measure the severity of energy poverty experiences, and we do look at it across groups, but it's limited. It's not participatory. It also like has a little bit of like fixation with numbers, and we like what is actually the adequate levels of support given how interconnected energy poverty is with other deprivations and income poverty issues, right? And these recommendations have big implications, so we want to be very careful with what we're saying here. Then the report finalizes with a structural analysis. So basically squeezing all of the data that Ireland has at its disposal, whether that is looking at disposable income, the share of tenants, and who was owning a house, who's renting, and under which conditions they're renting, the total housing cost, so other expenditures, just to try to be more comprehensive. But it's rare that policymakers will go that deep into the analysis. The report is structured with a bunch of highlights and key takeaways, and every section is just like bam, bam, 3 points of what you want to remember. And unfortunately, we have to work through this, and we lose so much of the complexity that we would like to include sometimes. So some of the reflections to conclude that I have is that as researchers and policymakers, we must be aware of how language and measurement and categorization are tools of power, how we are undemocratically selected to exercise those tools of power, to recognize our privilege and responsibility to act accordingly, that recognizing that problems and solutions are context dependent. We are in different moments, types, and we have different policy levers at our disposal depending on the specific country or time that we're in, political times that we're in. And well, it's a big challenge, and we're part of the system. So how can we do better? I guess that we can start by listening to Tony and the rest of our panelists.
Project. And also we have our final presentations from Dr. Antonella Mazzone along with Giacomo Facetta and Arinka De Chen from the University of Bristol and Euro-Mediterranean Center. So Antonella, yeah, please
Yes. Hi, everyone.
when you're ready. Yeah. And also,
can you see my screen?
yes, I can see your screen.
Is it in full or not? Not yet.
No, not in full,
No,
not
okay.
extended.
Cool.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm very
Yes,
interested
excellent.
to listen to your
Sorry, just one
presentation.
quick. Yeah, it's just please keep the presentation within 15 minutes. So we got a couple more minutes. Yeah, I know.
I
No,
will try to be really
short.
Hi everyone, my name is Antonella Mazzone and I'm a researcher from University of Bristol, and together with Giacomo Falchetta we're introducing the systemic cooling poverty initially as a concept, but then we are transforming it into an indicator. So it is no news that heat waves is causing more death each year, particularly in areas that are not well equipped with coping with heat. In the case of Europe, is one of the fastest continents that is reporting heat-related mortality, with just like last year around 67,000 deaths, which is exactly the same amount of deaths that Brazil has reported, but within 15 years of analysis. I wanted to highlight that most of the studies say that these deaths are preventable. So in order to understand how these deaths are preventable, I wanted to take a look at the health advisories in the ministries. And I compare these two health advisories in the UK and in Brazil. Keep in mind that the health advisories are homogenized to the World Health Organization. And most of the time they repeat the same things with very little variation, according also to the culture. But all of them, you will realize that they will repeat the same patterns. So it's about changing the patterns. You have to stay out of the sun between a certain time in the day, particularly between the hottest hours, right? Between 11 and 3 p.m. If you're going to do some physical activity, for example, exercise or walking the dog out, you have to do it in the cooler moments of the day. Or keep your home cool by closing the curtains and closing the windows. And if you go outside, wear suitable clothing. And drink plenty of fluids and avoid alcohol intake. They didn't say caffeine, and overly sugary drinks, but they're also linked to dehydration as well. Check on family and neighbors which are a higher risk, and know the symptoms of heat exhaustion. So this health advisory is very targeted around time that you have to change, but also your house and how to, prepare for excessive heat, about hydration and hydro practices, and about also social interactions. In Brazil, instead, the health advisory given in Brazil is slightly similar, but slightly different as well. Like, again, it repeats the same structure of avoiding, the hottest hours of the days, drink water regularly, avoid sun exposure, wearing light clothing, which is a very cultural thing in Brazil, to wear less and less and less, and cool off with cold showers. So hydro practices are really, really encouraged to take multiple showers, cold showers during the day, and never leave people and animals inside. So these are the health advisors. What do they tell us? That the health and the heat, the avoidance of heat stroke is in your hand, in the hand of the individuals. You have to do all these things in order to avoid heat stress. But if you try to apply this sort of health advisories recommendations here, which is like a community, is underserved communities of Rio de Janeiro. These are, let's say, informal occupations uphill. You'll see that you'll find a little bit of issues in following the simplest health advisories. The simplest health advisory is to keep hydrated, right? So you have to drink water regularly and cool off with cold showers. However, I just give a little bit of context. I am conducting virtual ethnography with groups in Rio de Janeiro since 2020. And each year they come to me with pictures, artworks, etc., but also complaints and memes in our virtual diaries about water interruptions. It's constant. It happens always, almost always during summertime, always during heat waves, and almost all the time about, in underserved communities, which can be communities in uphill settlements, or also at the outskirts of the center, so the periphery, which is extremely underserved, but also is in the hand of militia and other criminal groups. So if you look at the quote from Fernanda, who is a mixed race woman, mother of three, single mother, the quality of water in Rio is really bad. This is a statement from 2022. Last year, there was a huge issue with the authorities in Rio because tap water stank and it was brown. That's when I got the filter in my tap completely ruined, and I had to buy bottled water. The problem is that I live with 3 children. We consume 2 gallons of water per week, and each gallon of water costs 20 reais. So it means that 80 reais per month. But sometimes I can't afford this amount. So I either boil some of the water, or I found some ways to get it. Water is the most fundamental good, but water is not cheap. Here we don't drink tap water, and it's really bad. Other quotes, which I will keep very, very short, but this is quite important. It's been 5 days we don't have water in this neighborhood. Can you imagine during the heat wave not having water? I had to buy water to drink, which cost a fortune. And another one, we haven't been able to take a shower for over 7 days. Can you imagine this? Not being able to wash yourself after using the toilet? It's disgusting. I don't want to get closer to people. So the lack of water is hindering hydration, is hindering your health, is hindering everything. And so this highlights that a simple, health recommendation to keep cool, it's sometimes in certain contexts, I'm not saying that it's a global issue, but it's very much shared in the global south. This issue of water interruption, water shortages. Brazil is a relatively wealthy country, but still has 70% of the sanitation actually access. The sanitation, it has access to people. Another recommendation: avoid sun exposure between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. This is again, targeted for certain people because there are outdoor workers, of course, and informal workers. They actually take advantage of the heat in order to provide water for everybody else in the street and also for the drivers. In Rio de Janeiro, there is a lack of public toilets and there's a lack of a public fountain. So people cannot actually drink water while it's in the street. And another issue is not just outdoor workers, but also is about the time. So some institutions like schools, etc., they are set to specific times. So for example, when you pick up your children from school, it's always at a set time, and they do not recognize that the weather has changed, that heat waves are more deadly, and therefore mothers are forced to pick their children up at the same time, even if it's a scorching, outside. So the health advisory of keep out of the street and away from the sun from this time to this time does not apply to mothers or carers or anybody who has caring responsibility. Keep your home cool by closing the windows. In certain situations, there are no windows. This is a picture taken from, one of the participants. And although this is a specific reality of an underserved community in Brazil, this is a very much concept that you can apply everywhere else. You assume the fact that you have a home and you have a well-insulated home and you have curtains and you have windows. And in certain cases, even if you have all of this, the quality is not enough to thermally insulate your house. So we can apply this concept everywhere else, that the material and the quality of the material of your house may not be enough. Seek shade in green areas. So this is a very important topic because Rio de Janeiro does not lack green areas. As you can see from this picture, it has one of the major and the vastest urban forests in a megalopolis, right? But the problem is that underserved communities are located where the red area is, and it's basically almost impossible for them to seek shade or to seek a cool or a cooling or rich cooling island during the day because it's costly. It takes them hours because of also the transportation issue. So the transportation system does not really allow this. So this type of health recommendation may not apply to everybody. It can be easy for someone who lives nearby, which is the wealthier, a segment of population to seek shade in green areas, but most of the time, underserved population live far away from green areas. I will not read the quote because I'm concerned of time. So this fieldwork, this ongoing fieldwork, shows systemic issues that the region facing the highest risk of humid heat exposure under climate change frequently overlap with former colonial territories. And as a result, many of these areas experience deep socioeconomic and infrastructural and political instability, which in turn produces precarious public services and heightened dependence on external technologies. So if you read the recent papers on heat or humidity, they will highlight the tropical areas, right, as one of the most affected by it, right? But because of the history of colonization and the political instability that it caused and is still causing, it creates this vicious circle of structural inequality, high criminality and corruption, spatial and infrastructural precarity, and technological dependency. Keep in mind that most of the technology, but intended here also as building codes, the way that houses are built using a certain type of material, concrete, is not suitable in tropical areas. Was vernacular dwelling might have been a better solution, but because of colonization, that knowledge has been eradicated, right? So while some of these are specific and they're context-specific, systemic issue, I want to highlight the word systemic. There are some commonalities. So you might say, can I apply the systemic cooling poverty index or concept elsewhere? Of course, because increasing heat humidity is reported and is a concern everywhere in the world. More intense and prolonged days of unusual high temperatures are reported everywhere in the world. Intersectional identity-based discrimination, which prevents thermal safety in public spaces. So for example, I had the privilege of working with trans women in Rio de Janeiro, and they all reported that they do not want to go to public spaces. They do not want to use public toilets when they're present, and they do not want to go to green spaces because of discrimination. Is this recurrent elsewhere, not only in the global south, but everywhere in the world? Obsolete, inadequate building infrastructure and building codes, as I said earlier. Lack of green and blue spaces, especially accessible to the underprivileged. Lack of affordable, accessible, and adequate transport. This is a recurrent theme. So imagine you live in an underserved community on top of a hill with a high density of houses, one on top of each other, and not being able to go down or uphill because it's extremely hot. You live in a sweat trap. Basically, this is thermal violence, as Starosielski will say. Can this apply elsewhere? Of course, because urban heat island, and we've seen many papers that are indicating the spatial inequality, especially related to heat in many cities around the world, and also in the US especially. So urban heat island, as I said, is present everywhere, and heat dump from AC and vehicle is something related to environmental justice, because the comfort of someone is most of the time detrimental for everybody else who's in the street. So the heat dump from the vehicle and buses and traffic and AC as well is very much seen everywhere else in the world. Social isolation as well is an emerging issue. Lack of cooling shelters, although there are some initiatives, especially in Europe and in the US as well, they're still lacking. And insufficient cold chain for nutrition and food safety, perhaps more common in the global majority spaces. So after all of this, field work and bringing together the lived experiences of the participants, we've been putting together these dimensions and put together what are the systemic issues that prevent people from being cool and thermally safe in every space, not just home, not in the street, not in between, not in the transportation, everywhere, right? So, and this is why it differs a little bit from energy poverty or energy access. It does not focus exclusively on individual ability to access energy services, but it's the context, is the system, is everything else that should be in place by the government in order to ensure thermal safety. And we identified 5 different dimensions: climate, infrastructure and assets, thermal and social and thermal inequalities, health and education and work standards. I do not have the time to go through every single one, and I leave the word to Giacomo to explain to you what's the project about and what we want to create. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation and for organizing this highly interesting event. I know the time is extremely short, so I will be trying to really give you just an overview and then happy to discuss follow-up situation.
Sorry, Giacomo, do you want to share or you want me to share?
May I ask if you could just move the slides as I speak? Thank you. I think it would be handy. So Antonella gave you, let's say, a conceptual, very conceptual overview of how this concept came about in the first place. So how this intersection of different dimensions that are together contributing to determine conditions of discomfort, basically, and incapacity or lack of ability to be comfort that come from a wide range of factors that are not only dependent on the individual level or individual choices, but by far and large they depend on the system actually and the provisioning systems that are available to each individual. So of course, measuring this plethora of factors is very complex, and in particular it becomes even more challenging when you want to move from the scale of a local, let's say, ethnographic study where you really have the chance to talk to people and think different experiments and try to generate a picture which is broader, geographic also, so you want to capture, say, population or even set of population. So some very issues ongoing work that we are is to try to combine a pool of existing data, so of secondary data that was already collected or produced in previous activities, the bulk of which is provided through the USAID or former USAID demographic and health surveys initiative, which is commendable initiative, to track different well-being and health-related indicators in a standardized way across both countries, especially in the global south, and to measure or ask questions also in some extent in a standardized but qualitative way on things such as access to infrastructure, access to means of information, to transport, health conditions, and so on. So this provides very interesting individual level information from a pool of countries. So in our ongoing work, we started from pulling together this information from a large number of surveys. We managed to put together 28 countries with this with recent weights, so where this observations have been conducted over recent year, the last 5 years more or less, and to parse them or combine with an additional set of characteristics that describe more the context or the infrastructural kind of texture where people are located. So putting together all this information to try to capture these different dimensions of systemic poverty that Antonella was going through, we aimed at defining a pool of deprivation indicators that could capture these different intersections of what we call systemic poverty, and ultimately allow us to look at a quite functionally granular, so the subnational scale, and to understand not only what is the extent of this concept that we call systemic poverty, but also what are its determinants in different contexts among different social, economic, cultural, and kind of strata of the population and society. So, Antonella, maybe we can skip these details which concern more the calculation of the indicators and move to the next slide just to give an overview of what type of measures or indicators we produce. So, to the next. Next. Okay, this is just a picture of different countries where we can collect recent DHS data and this number of indicators that we characterize to define systemic poverty dimension. As you can see, they are quite rich in their capacity to capture dimensions which are not always immediately measured or connected to the concept with its three concepts of energy poverty. Water drinking and access to water, drinking water and sanitation, which of course the global north are taken for granted, but they are absolutely not for granted particularly in the global south, they are crucial for them for the development. Housing materials, so and how architectures are designed and in which conditions, so, which building material conditions. Justice dimension, so factors such as religion, gender, or age, and a number of additional factors you can see yourself within the time to move from that role. Move to the next slide. We draw a number of we will rely, let's say, on a set of criteria and definitions which are based both on seminal literature studies and on expert opinion that we interact with to understand and define a set of criteria which we deem to be appropriate to define deprivation among these different indicators and then dimensions. And of course, since these are important and difficult choices at times to define what is deprived, what is not deprived, so far, of course, we engage with experts, but we also evaluate very carefully what is the sensitivity or the implication of giving a certain definition or selecting a certain threshold rather than another one. So we end up choosing some criteria, but we also conduct a careful assessment of what alternative definitions might imply. So next slide, please. And we end up with this type of multidimensional kind of assessment. These are country level results. So of course, then we can also look at within countries. This is a summary within for across countries that we assess that allow us to get a sense of both what is the total extent of systemic equilibrium poverty, which is more or less what is can be summarized as the area of these shapes for each country. So the bigger area it has, the more we argue that systemic equilibrium poverty is more prevalent and intense in a country, but also the different determinants and drivers, which is given by the shape. So you, depending on the shapes of which indicators, we find the largest proportion of the population to be deprived or having an issue with, the more the shape is determined by this. So this is of course very a big wealth of information, so requires quite some careful discussion, which we not have time to conduct now. But if we move to the next slide, we also can simplify or make this more easily readable by aggregating it across the 5 core dimensions of systemic equilibrium poverty, which are, let's say, produced by aggregation of the different indicators by an aggregation procedure. And you can see what maybe the key message is that a country or a person can be in a condition of that we define as systemic equilibrium poverty, even if this person is not living in the hottest country in the world. That is to say that the deprivation is systemic. It's coming from a number of factors, and being ill-prepared or vulnerable to heat might be sufficient for being at risk in the moment that a sudden, unexpected kind of or unprecedented heat wave occurs in a context, maybe a context which was not historically prone or prepared to experience those type of events. So we think it's important to look beyond climate and capacity or to adapt through, say, appliances, and look really at the whole holistic view of provisioning systems or lack of provisioning systems that underlie what we call systemic equilibrium poverty. Next slide, please. Oops. Okay, time is running short, so I just wanted to give you the last kind of few words on our assessments. So we are able kind of to come up with some estimates of what are the prevalent drivers of deprivation across world regions for the countries we cover, what are the different shares of populations that we believe to be deprived across the different dimensions of sustainable poverty. And overall, in our sample represents more or less 3 billion people. So it's a statistical representative of 3 billion people around the world. And we found that in the countries highlighted in the chart, in the map, approximately 40% of the population live in regions where we find moderate, at least moderate levels of sustainable poverty, while nearly 20%, so 500 million people, are located in areas with severe level of deprivation with respect to what we define as systemic poverty. And yeah, the last slide, just to show that it's not enough to look at countries as a whole, but we really need to also look within countries as or within regions and within cities as well when the data allow for it, because deprivation is hiding and it's well masked often in statistical aggregates. So it's really crucial to look within and have a look at where things are most critical and how inequality is structural determinant also of what we call a systemic winning poverty. So it's really important to leverage the data when it's available to spend the time to look really at what's going on within and not only say across, even in this type of large scale cross-country studies. Okay, I'll stop here for the interest of
Thank
time.
you.
Thank you very much for.
Sorry, it's so limited time and it's so challenging to limit our fascinating presentations with very limited time scale. I wish we could have stay here for longer time. So maybe I saw one question from Neil that asked Tony about the choice of naming for the office and the policies. Do you want to quickly maybe comment or answer these questions, Tony?
Yeah, very quickly. Thank you everybody for your presentations. It's really awesome how they all kind of built on each other and actually connected in amazing ways. And so I'm excited to follow up with folks. But your question is right on point, Neil. The focus on affordability, maybe a little short-sighted thinking about justice and equity, which have become banned terms by the current administration. But I think we have a policy window, this focus on affordability, to continue some of the work that we did. We just have to think about, ways to say for all versus trying to focus on the communities that have been actually disadvantaged by government. So maybe using them as a Trojan horse to continue doing this work, which I think aligns with what everyone was saying. So thanks for the question.
Thank you, Tony. Yeah, and I think it's we are running late, a little bit late today. I'm so sorry for that, but thank you for all joining us today. And it's been fantastic to start the week with such a powerful conversation. And don't forget to join us tomorrow for our structural barrier session, and where we will explore systemic obstacles in energy justice. So I look forward to seeing many of you there and take care. Let's stay in touch. So see you tomorrow. And, have a
Have a
nice
great
rest
week,
of the day.
everybody. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.